Hey there, neighbors. Just a quick request before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short form content on places like Instagram and TikTok, and then reposting that stuff to places like Threads and X and Facebook. So if you would, go to the podcast website, www.neighborontheleft.com, and in the contact section, all the social media links are there. Stop on over and check out some of the short form content. It tends to be a bit more lighthearted, at least some of it, more comedic than the heavy podcast episodes. But I would love to have you stop by, and if you'd be so kind to like and follow what you see. Thank you very much. And on to the episode. So there's a woman in Georgia turning on her kitchen faucet, and the water is coming out brown. And I don't mean cloudy. I don't mean slightly discolored. I mean brown, like the kind of water that makes you stop and stare for a second before your brain catches up with what your eyes are seeing. And as our mental camera pans past her, we see out of her kitchen window, and nearby, rising from the ground like some kind of futuristic industrial fortress, is a massive data center tied to the artificial intelligence boom. Now, to be clear, nobody's saying that, ChatGPT itself crawled into the pipes like some sort of horror movie and personally mud wrestled the municipal water supply. But residents in parts of Georgia have been sounding alarms for months about water pressure problems and sediment issues and infrastructure strain connected to enormous new data center developments that have been popping up. And whether every single claim proves to be true or not almost misses the bigger point, because this story reveals something most Americans still don't fully understand. The internet is physical. The cloud, as in cloud storage, is physical. Artificial intelligence is physical. Every TikTok video, every Netflix binge, every AI-generated image, every Facebook post from your weird uncle explaining how chemtrails are turning the frogs gay, all of it lives somewhere in a physical space. And it's not in the sky, it's not in an actual cloud, it's not floating through the heavens like digital fairy dust. It lives in giant industrial facilities packed with servers, cooling systems, power substations, backup generators, fiber optic lines, and enough computing hardware to make a NASA engineer from 1983 spontaneously combust. And these places are getting bigger, much bigger, because artificial intelligence didn't just increase demand for data centers, it detonated it. Tech companies are now racing to build enormous AI infrastructure all across America. Rural communities, former industrial towns, places with cheap land, access to water, and massive amounts of electricity, including right around me in my home area of Pennsylvania. And the pitch always sounds exciting. The future, economic growth, high-tech investment, the next digital revolution. But increasingly, communities are beginning to ask some uncomfortable questions. How much water do these places use? How much electricity? Why are some of them being built next to nuclear plants? Why are residents near certain projects complaining about noise and environmental strain and utility concerns? And maybe most importantly, who's benefiting from these things and who's absorbing the costs? Because the cloud has a zip code, and increasingly it's moving into somebody's hometown. So today I'm going to tell you everything that Jane and John Q. Public need to know about data centers. Happy Monday, everybody, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we are talking about data centers. You may have heard about them on the news recently. You might have a vague idea that they're tied to the internet and to AI. But I want to go through the whole thing today and let everyone know, particularly any listeners that I might have who, aren't computer geeks, explain what exactly is going on and what I think you need to know if you happen to be in one of these locations where a data center is coming to live. So let's just start off at the beginning. What the hell is a data center? If you ask most people that question, they usually picture something vaguely technological, a room with computers, maybe blinking lights, perhaps a guy with a name like Trevor wearing a headset and saying things like, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" But modern data centers aren't rooms. They're more like campuses, industrial scale computing factories. Some of them are the size of multiple football fields, large enough to be seen clearly with satellite imagery. And inside these facilities are row after row after row of servers, thousands of them, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Think of a server as a specialized computer whose entire purpose is handling digital tasks for millions of people at once. When you send an email, stream a movie, save a photo, use Google Maps, scroll Instagram, when you ask Alexa a question, if you have an argument with ChatGPT because it misunderstood your sarcasm, there's a better than likely chance that a data center is somewhere working on this task for you. That's what the cloud actually is. The cloud is just, in essence, somebody else's computer. Except the computer is the size of a Costco and consumes enough energy, enough electricity to make your electric meter spin like a centrifuge. Now, data centers have existed for years. The internet has always needed physical infrastructure, but something changed recently, and that is artificial intelligence. And this is where the scale of the story becomes difficult to wrap your head around. Traditional internet activity, while massive, is relatively lightweight compared to modern AI workloads. A Google search, that's small. Streaming a movie, larger but manageable. Training an advanced AI model, that is an entirely different beast. AI systems require gigantic clusters of specialized computer chips called GPUs, or graphics processing units. Now, originally GPUs were mostly associated with gaming because they were really good at handling graphics. Then the tech industry realized that GPUs were also incredibly effective for artificial intelligence calculations, and suddenly the AI arms race began. Now, every major tech company wants larger AI models, faster AI responses, more AI integration into everything, and more computing power than their competitors. That means more servers. Servers means more cooling, more electricity, more buildings, more infrastructure. And unlike the old image many folks had of the internet as something sort of invisible and weightless, the World Wide Web, AI infrastructure is extremely physical. AI runs on concrete and steel and fiber optics and cooling towers, substations, on rivers and reservoirs and megawatts. In fact, some experts believe the AI boom may trigger one of the largest infrastructure expansions in modern technological history, which is why tech companies are suddenly racing to build hyperscale data centers all across the country. And, hyperscale, I'm talking absurdly enormous. We're talking facilities designed specifically for massive cloud computing and AI operations at an industrial scale. And these projects are often strategically placed in rural communities, former industrial regions, areas with cheaper land, places with large power capacity, and locations with access to a lot of water. Which brings us to Pennsylvania. And I'm not just picking Pennsylvania because that's where I'm from. Northeastern and central Pennsylvania are increasingly being viewed as prime territory for the AI infrastructure gold rush. Former coal regions, industrial corridors, communities hungry for economic investment. Places that already know what it means when outside industries arrive promising prosperity and, quote-unquote, the future. And to be fair, there are reasons towns want these projects, but that's where the story starts getting a little bit complicated. Now, at this point, it would be really easy to turn this episode into big scary tech company just descends from the sky like robot vultures. AI already conjures up, images of Skynet from the Terminator franchise, but reality, of course, is more complicated than that. Because many communities actively want these facilities. And honestly, it's understandable why they would. Imagine you're a local official in a struggling town. The factories left years ago. The coal jobs disappeared. Younger residents seem to be moving away. Storefronts downtown are half empty, and the local tax base looks like it's being held together with duct tape and a prayer. Then a major tech company shows up promising billions in investment, construction jobs, infrastructure improvements, and national attention. To a lot of local governments, that sounds like economic rescue, especially in places in these areas, like these areas of Pennsylvania, where many communities have spent decades trying to reinvent themselves after the decline of coal, steel, manufacturing, and heavy industry. And tech companies know this. That's one reason why they often target post-industrial regions, rural areas, and economically struggling towns. Cheap land helps, access to electricity helps, water helps, but communities eager for development, that could be the biggest factor of all. Because towns are not just passively accepting these projects. In many cases, they're competing for them. And this is where things get politically interesting. Local governments often offer massive incentive packages to attract data centers. Tax breaks, property abatements, infrastructure subsidies, fast-track zoning, utility agreements, sometimes even special legislative carve-outs. Basically, it's turning a lot of places into the pick-me girls of rural America. And from the town's perspective, you can understand the temptation. Nobody wants to be the community that says no to the future, especially when neighboring counties are saying yes. It sort of becomes like an economic development Hunger Games. If we don't land this project, another town will. But critics argue this dynamic creates a race to the bottom, where enormous corporations gain tremendous leverage over local governments just because they're desperate for investment. And there's the uncomfortable reality that often gets overlooked in this whole pick-me stage. Once construction ends, data centers often employ far fewer permanent workers than people ever imagine. A billion-dollar facility may create a large temporary construction boom, but afterward, the permanent workforce may only number in the dozens. Now, dozens of jobs is not nothing. Those are real jobs. But compared to the size of the investment and the scale of the environmental footprint, critics increasingly are asking whether communities are truly getting a proportional benefit, especially when tax incentives are involved. Imagine giving massive tax breaks to a facility that ends up using enormous amounts of energy, consumes huge quantities of water, occupies vast tracts of land, and permanently employs fewer people than a medium-sized Walmart. That's where the skepticism kicks in. And then there's another issue, secrecy. Some communities have complained that negotiations around these projects happen with limited transparency. Residents are being kept in the dark. They sometimes don't learn the full scale of the water usage or the power demand or the generator systems or the infrastructure impacts until after approvals are already moving forward. And as I mentioned, this is not just happening in Georgia or Virginia or Texas. Pennsylvania is increasingly part of this story because the coal region, as we all like to call it, checks a lot of boxes that tech companies love. Lots of available land, cooler climate, existing transmission infrastructure, the availability of natural gas and nuclear power, and then communities eager for economic development. So in other words, the AI boom is not, some distant Silicon Valley phenomenon anymore. The infrastructure for it is moving into ordinary American towns at an alarming rate, including towns that may not fully understand what they're agreeing to yet. And nowhere do these concerns become more visible than when you start talking about water. Water is the hidden cost of AI. I don't know how hidden it is anymore, but when most people think about artificial intelligence, they're thinking about computers. They're not thinking about water. A lot of people think that, water and computers are about as far from each other as they can possibly be. But yet increasingly, one of the biggest environmental debates surrounding AI and AI infrastructure is not about software at all. It's about plumbing. Because modern data centers generate enormous amounts of heat. Picture tens of thousands of high-powered computer chips operating constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that equipment gets hot. And if you don't cool it properly, the servers fail. Which means all those cheerful AI commercials showing futuristic assistants helping you write emails and organize vacation photos are, behind the scenes, dependent on these giant cooling systems working nonstop to keep industrial computing hardware from cooking itself to death. And one of the cheapest and most effective ways to cool these facilities is with water. Lots of it. In some cases, millions of gallons per day. Now, to be fair, not every data center uses the same amount of water. Some newer facilities use other methods, air cooling, recycled wastewater, closed loop systems, hybrid cooling technologies that can dramatically reduce water consumption. Those systems exist. But here's the issue. They are often much more expensive. And I can assume that you're able to do the math that happens when a corporation has a choice between two options and one of them is a whole lot cheaper. And this is where the environmental debate really begins, because critics argue that corporations under pressure to maximize profits and expand AI capacity quickly will choose cheaper cooling strategies whenever regulations will let them, especially in communities with weaker oversight or plentiful municipal water access. So what does this mean in practice? Well, imagine a small or mid-sized community with aging infrastructure, pipes that may be already decades old, water systems designed for residential neighborhoods and ordinary commercial growth. Now, all of a sudden, you insert a giant industrial facility demanding just enormous daily water usage. That can create pressure changes in municipal systems. It can stress aging infrastructure. It can disturb sediment that's already sitting inside old pipes. And that's part of the reason why residents near some of the projects have reported things like, brown or cloudy water, major reductions in pressure, concerns about long-term water availability. Now, again, to be responsible here, that does not automatically mean a data center directly caused every single water problem that people experience nearby. Infrastructure issues can have multiple causes, but what's increasingly difficult to deny is that these facilities place enormous new demands on local systems, and residents are beginning to notice, especially if you're talking about a place that can experience drought conditions. Because, here's where the optics become brutal. In some regions, ordinary people are being asked to conserve water, shorten their showers and avoid watering lawns and reduce household usage, while nearby, the industrial server campus consumes staggering amounts of municipal water to support the AI expansion. And, as you can imagine, that tends to make people cranky. And understandably so. Particularly when the corporations involved are among the wealthiest companies on earth. Now, defenders of the industry point out something important. Modern life depends on this infrastructure. And they are not wrong. Streaming services, cloud storage, banking systems, hospitals, communications, emergency services. All of these things require the data infrastructure. So the conversation is not should data centers exist at all, because that's simply not realistic. The real question is who bears the environmental cost of building this future? Because there are always ways to reduce the impact. Companies can use reclaimed wastewater instead of drinking water. They can invest more in these advanced cooling systems. They can do things to improve efficiency. They can recycle water. They can design facilities that minimize strain on municipal systems. And those approaches, as I said, cost money. And this is one of the recurring themes you're going to hear throughout this episode. Again and again, communities are finding themselves trapped between being involved in technological progress and the corporate pressure to build that progress as cheaply and as quickly as possible. And water is only one part of the equation. Because if these facilities drink enormous amounts of water, the amount of electricity they consume is on another level entirely. All right, so that brings us to electricity, noise, and the environmental cost of the cloud. If water is the hidden cost of artificial intelligence, electricity is the monster hiding in the basement. Because these facilities do not merely use power, they inhale it. A modern hyperscale data center can consume as much electricity as a small city. And AI-focused facilities are pushing those demands even higher because AI workloads require far more computing power than traditional internet activity. This is one of the reasons utility companies across the country are suddenly scrambling to prepare for exploding demand. And when I say exploding, I mean exploding. For years, electricity demand in parts of the United States has been relatively stable. Then AI showed up. And now utility planners are trying to figure out how to power these gigantic server campuses with advanced AI systems, crypto operations in some regions, expanding electrification, and just a broader digital economy all at the same time. And this is where Pennsylvania enters the conversation in a very big way, because Pennsylvania has something tech companies desperately want: power. Lots of it. They have a natural gas infrastructure, transmission capacity, nuclear power, industrial land, generally cooler temperatures, and relatively close proximity to major East Coast population centers. Which is why a lot of analysts believe Pennsylvania could become one of the country's major AI infrastructure corridors over the next decade. Now, supporters argue this creates huge economic opportunity, and maybe it does. But critics are increasingly asking, who exactly pays for all the infrastructure required to support this boom? Because electrical grids do not magically expand themselves. Substations have to be upgraded. Transmission systems have to be expanded. Generation capacity is increased, and somebody's got to pay for that. The concern in some states is that ordinary utility customers would eventually absorb a part of the cost through higher rates, while the giant corporations consume enormous amounts of power. Imagine opening your electric bill one day and realizing your monthly costs have doubled, partly because somewhere nearby an AI server farm the size of an airport terminal is processing, millions of chatbot prompts and AI-generated headshots. That possibility has regulators and consumer advocates paying very close attention to the whole story. And then there's the backup power issue. Most large data centers maintain enormous backup generator systems in case the grid fails. These are usually diesel generators, plural, very plural. We're talking about, we're not talking about one little emergency generator for a hospital. Some facilities maintain dozens. Some maintain massive arrays of diesel generators for the event that there's an electricity failure. And during testing or outages, those generators produce an amazing amount of air pollution, particulate emissions, greenhouse gases, and also a whole lot of noise. Which brings us to another thing people often don't realize. Data centers aren't always quiet. Now, from the outside, they may look quiet. They don't have smokestacks. There's no giant assembly lines. There's no molten steel pouring, dramatically into industrial molds. But many residents near large facilities describe constant mechanical noise. Some describe it as a hum, cooling fans, industrial chillers, ventilation systems, backup equipment, all running 24 hours a day. Some people compare it like living near an airport, not next to the airport, but near the airport, or near a power plant, or near a giant HVAC system that just never shuts off. And this gets into an environmental justice issue that progressives have been raising more and more often, because these projects frequently end up in, again, rural areas, working class communities, former industrial towns, and places that generally have less political leverage. And, the communities are often told this is economic progress, and some of it is. But history has taught a lot of Americans to ask important follow-up questions. Who is the progress for? Because the AI revolution may arrive wrapped in sleek branding and futuristic commercials, but physically, it often looks a lot like old school industrial expansion. And the difference is that instead of railroads and smokestacks and coal breakers, it's server racks and cooling towers and substations and fiber optic cables. And nowhere does that historical echo hit harder than here in Pennsylvania. Some make a very clear correlation between data centers and the coal companies that this region used to deal with. And I want to be clear about something before, somebody clips this out of context and posts it online. I am not saying data centers are literally the same thing as coal mines. A server farm is obviously not identical to a strip mine. The environmental impacts are different. The labor structure is different. The technology, of course, is different. But if you grew up in Pennsylvania, especially in or around former coal region towns, some of this story probably starts to feel eerily familiar because there are echoes. Outside corporations arrive promising jobs and prosperity. Local governments compete aggressively for investment. Communities are told they're participating in the future. Environmental concerns are always minimized, and tax incentives are handed out, and infrastructure gets reshaped around whatever the corporate need is. And ordinary residents are sort of left trying to figure out, what exactly are we getting out of this? And that pattern is not new. Pennsylvania has lived versions of that story before. Coal companies once transformed entire towns. Steel companies built local economies around industrial independence. Factories arrived with promises of prosperity and permanence. Sometimes those industries genuinely did provide enormous economic benefits, but history also showed us that, something else is true. When corporations become powerful enough, communities can gradually lose leverage over their own future. And I think that's one of the deeper tensions surrounding this AI infrastructure boom. Because this is not just about technology. It's about power. Political power, economic power, infrastructure power. Who controls the resources? Who influences the local governments? Who absorbs the environmental costs? And then who receives the profit? And increasingly, people are asking whether the AI economy is reproducing a very old American model. Privatized profit, socialized consequences. Now, defenders of the industry would say that that's being unfair. And to be fair, there is truth to the argument that data centers do bring investment and tax revenue and technological advancement and infrastructure development. Modern society genuinely depends on digital infrastructure now. As I mentioned some of these things before: hospitals, emergency services, banking systems, communications, not just artificial intelligence. But you have none of it without massive computing infrastructure. That's real. But critics argue the problem is not the existence of the technology. It's the imbalance of power surrounding it. Because right now, enormous corporations often negotiate with these small local communities from a position of overwhelming leverage. A struggling town sees jobs and construction and investment, that they see hope. A $1 trillion corporation sees cheap land, water access, electric capacity, and favorable tax treatment. Those are not equal negotiating positions. And once these facilities are built, communities may discover they have less influence than they even thought, especially if environmental concerns begin appearing later, especially if utility costs rise, if water systems become strained, if promised economic benefits don't quite materialize the way that they were advertised. And there's another layer to this conversation that I think makes people uneasy, like on a gut level. Many of these AI systems are being developed, at least in part, to automate jobs. So some communities are starting to feel like they're being asked to sacrifice water and energy and land and tax revenue and maybe even environmental stability to help build technologies that may eventually reduce human labor in the broader economy. And, that creates a very strange emotional tension. The town hosts the infrastructure while the long-term economic benefits may flow somewhere else entirely. And honestly, if you zoom out far enough, I guess what we're really talking about here is a question America keeps asking over and over and over again, just in different forms. Who should bear the cost of progress? Because every era has its version of this fight. Railroads, coal, oil, factories, highways, chemical plants, fracking. Now it's AI infrastructure. And once again, communities are trying to figure out how to balance economic development, technological advancement, environmental stewardship, and democratic accountability all at the same time. Which brings us to the final question. does all of this mean data centers are inherently bad? No. But it does mean communities should probably stop treating them like, a magical, consequence-free cloud infrastructure that's floating harmlessly above reality. Because the cloud is not weightless. It has pipes and power lines and cooling towers. It has consequences. Now, at this point in this episode, I'm thinking that some of you may be saying to yourselves, so what are you saying here? No internet, no AI, no technology. Should we all communicate by carrier pigeon and, carve our tweets into tree bark? And I know that there's a lot of people out there who will say, maybe honestly, maybe sometimes not so honestly, that they yearn for the days before we had any of this technology. But no, I'm not saying that it should go away. That's not the argument. The argument is not, just simply technology bad. The argument is powerful industries should not get a free pass to externalize environmental and community costs simply because they've wrapped themselves in this futuristic branding. And this is important because data centers are not inherently destructive. In fact, there are ways to build them far more responsibly. I've mentioned some of these. The technology exists. The question is whether the corporations are willing to spend the money and whether governments are willing to require it. For example, some facilities now use reclaimed wastewater instead of drinking water for cooling. That means instead of pulling huge amounts of potable water from municipal systems, they use treated wastewater that would otherwise be discarded. That alone can dramatically reduce strain on local communities. Other facilities use advanced cooling technologies that require less water overall. And they are more expensive, at least in most cases. They are more environmentally responsible. And right there is the tension. Because once you understand this issue, you start seeing this pattern over and over again. Many solutions exist. They simply require a reduction of short-term profits. And that's where regulation enters the conversation. Now, I know these days, the word regulation causes a lot of people to react like, a vampire hearing somebody open, a garlic bread factory. But regulations are not automatically anti-business, despite what this current administration wants to ram down our throats. Sometimes they are simply the rules society creates to prevent powerful entities from dumping costs onto everyone else. Because without oversight, the incentive structure is painfully obvious. Build faster, build cheaper, expand aggressively, maximize shareholder returns. And if the local infrastructure struggles later, that becomes the community's problem. That's why critics increasingly argue communities need stronger protections before approving these projects. Things like mandatory environmental impact assessments, water use transparency, stronger zoning requirements, noise restrictions, utility cost projections for the residents, public disclosure agreements, independent infrastructure studies, and requirements to use more sustainable cooling systems whenever it's feasible. Not because technology is evil, but because history repeatedly shows what happens when industries expand faster than public oversight. And to be fair, some tech companies are trying to improve sustainability. Several major corporations have announced goals that are related to renewable energy and water replenishment and carbon reduction and just more efficient infrastructure overall. That's real. But critics often point out an important distinction. Corporate sustainability promises are not the same thing as enforceable accountability, especially when communities are dealing with immediate local impacts in the present tense. And honestly, this entire conversation reveals something much larger than the data centers or whatever itself. It reveals this collision between technological acceleration and corporate power and environmental reality and democratic control. Because AI is advancing incredibly fast, much faster than laws get passed, faster than infrastructure planning, faster than public understanding. And communities are increasingly finding themselves asked to make permanent decisions about these facilities tied to technologies that are evolving at breakneck speed. Even if you understand what's going on, in May, you may be dealing with a totally different animal by September. That deserves scrutiny. I'm not saying panic. I'm not saying conspiracy theories. I'm nothing anti-technology by any stretch. Just scrutiny. Because once these projects are approved and built, communities often live with the consequences for decades. Which brings me to the final thing that I want to leave you with. The internet once felt invisible, weightless, abstract, but increasingly we're discovering the digital world has a physical footprint after all, and a very large one. The internet changed so gradually that most of us never really stopped to think about what it physically became. We all use words like the cloud and wireless and virtual and online. And all of those words have a very light sort of feeling to them. Almost magical, I guess. But behind every swipe and stream and search and prompt and upload and AI-generated image, there are actual physical places. Massive industrial facilities, power lines stretching across landscapes, cooling towers pulling water from local systems, substations humming through the night, diesel generators waiting for outages, small communities trying to negotiate with giant corporations that are more powerful than a lot of governments. The digital world is not floating above reality. It's built directly into reality, into towns and ecosystems and electric grids and water systems and local politics now. And that does not automatically make it evil by any stretch. I want to say that again clearly, because nuance on the internet now has, a very small life expectancy. Technology itself is not the enemy. Artificial intelligence is not automatically the enemy. Data centers, in and of themselves, are not inherently evil. Modern society genuinely depends on this digital infrastructure. But dependence should not mean blind acceptance. And progress should not mean communities surrendering their leverage, their resources, or their environmental protection simply because somebody in a corporate boardroom attached the words innovation and the future to a proposal. Because history has taught us something very important. Every era promises its new industry will change the world. And often it does. Railroads did, coal did, oil did, factories changed the world. The internet, oh Lord, has the internet changed the world? And now AI may change the world too. But the real question is not whether technology advances. It always does. The question is whether ordinary people get a voice in how that future is built, who profits from it, and who absorbs the cost. And that conversation is no longer theoretical. It's happening right now in Georgia and Virginia and Texas, and increasingly right here in Pennsylvania. Because the cloud has a zip code, and somebody has to live next to it. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode from your neighbor on the left. This one, I'm dying to hear from people about this one, especially people in the areas that I mentioned near me in Pennsylvania or wherever this is an immediate reality, I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts, hear people's experiences. As always, I'm looking for feedback on the podcast in the general sense, whether you like it or you don't, or you have questions or concerns or whatever. If you go to the website, neighborontheleft.com, go to the contacts page, you can find all the ways to reach out to the podcast, whether it be through social media or using the email address. While you're there, you can check out all the old episodes of the podcast on the episodes page. You can download them or stream them. And if you want to find out where I'm getting my information from, go to the blog section where I post a post that matches each episode of the podcast, and at the end of it, I include all of my sources. I will be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.